Welcome to Law Next, the podcast where we put a spotlight on the latest news and developments coming out of the legal tech industry. I'm Bob Ambrogi, and in each episode of Law Next PR, we interview a legal tech company about their latest developments. Today, we're talking about the legal technology company Litera and how a new approach to building software enabled it to develop AI products faster than it ever could before. Joining me to tell us all about it and talk about it is Greg Ingino, Chief Technology Officer at Litera. Greg, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Bob. Appreciate it.
So we are going to be talking today about how your R&D organization basically doubled its productivity within 12 months by building an agentic product development lifecycle using a system of AI agents called mates. And hopefully you're going to explain all of that to us. But I wondered if we could kind of go back to the beginning here, which is that I think it was 18 months ago, maybe more at this point, that you saw a demonstration that convinced you that software development was about to change fundamentally. What was it that you saw, and what was your takeaway from it?
Yeah, so I was invited out to a CEO summit that was hosted by our private equity company, and we were out there. AI was, the hot topic at the time. And I remember we were watching a demo from a company called Cognition, and Russell was up there, one of the co-founders, and he was demonstrating what this new agentic development agent called Devin was able to do. And I remember watching that demo, and essentially he gave it a list of product requirements and fed it into, Devin, and Devin not only went and developed it, but it built all the test cases, deployed it to production. And it really opened my eyes. And I think I realized at that point that, the future of developing software was going to drastically change.
And you're of course Chief Technology Officer at Litera. Tell me a little bit about your background and what your responsibilities are.
Yeah, sure. So here at Litera, I run our engineering, quality, security, operations areas within the company. So I'm responsible for everything technology, as you would say it. My background is I've worked in SaaS-based companies for the last 20 some odd years, been in the private equity space for about 12 of those years now, working with the private equity firms and transforming companies and really maturing their overall technology organizations. So very much like what we've been doing over the last 3 years here at Litera.
So Greg, you saw this demo of Devin and you got excited by what you saw. So when you kind of got back to work and got back to Litera, how did you kind of translate that excitement into a plan?
Yeah. So the first thing was they were taking a limited number of customers under their umbrella in the initial pilot launch. And so the first thing we did was we made sure that we got to the top of the list and got access to that software. And we didn't stop there. We actually looked at a number of other providers, GitHub Copilot, Cursor, ended up bringing a suite of tools in. What I did when I got back was we started doing demonstrations of what I saw out there in Silicon Valley to a number of our key leaders within the technology space, and it opened their eyes as well. What that led to ultimately was, a launch of I wouldn't say an invite only, but a program where technology folks had to actually opt into it, right? And so what we did was we demoed it to
Litera, or
yeah, technology folks within Litera, particularly the engineering. So engineering quality organizations, because we saw the most potential lift there. We demoed some of the capabilities around what we saw and what we thought could be done with it. Had a couple other vendors, so we had our own technology day. And what we did was invited people to participate in the program, right? And as part of that participation, you had to do weekly demos. You had to, show how you're using the tool. And that really created a snowball effect within, right? It was this excitement within the company. And we saw more and more people opting into the program, versus us actually pushing down the tool and forcing the adoption initially.
So for people out there who don't work in R&D, who aren't technologists per se, what was it about this that got you so excited? I mean, was it simply the potential for faster development and deployment?
Yeah, correct. I mean, the speed at which it could translate and interpret and consume data and be able to create outputs around that. I think all of us technology leaders, have been suffering from a mountain of technical debt. And, there's a lot of, things within the organization that, let's just say, aren't people's favorite things to do. And this was an opportunity to, offload, those skills and offload, the need to do that to these agents, right? And allow people to, be more strategic in their work. So, seeing the ability for it to document an entire, code library, within a few minutes and produce a well-written, documentation around it is something that would take, weeks for an engineer to do, and probably one of the worst jobs that they typically want to avoid.
Yeah. So again, with an eye toward some of the people who may be watching or listening to this who aren't immersed in techno jargon, when you're talking about an agentic PDLC, what do you mean? Explain that in plain English.
Yeah. Well, the PDLC is a product development lifecycle, and it's all the way from an idea of something that somebody wants to build, into building those requirements, and to translating it into actual technical specs that engineering teams can consume. It's to developing quality and test cases, to deployment, to operationalizing it, and even the go-to-market pieces of it. When we talk a little bit later about the MATES program, right? The MATES program was basically to take the individuals who were doing each piece of that PDLC and figuring out what those individuals did, and decomposing the skills of those individuals, and then figuring out how to use these agents and developing the same skills within these agents to be able to produce the same work, ultimately in delivering software. So the real intent of this is, how quickly can we take an idea all the way to deployment? And we look at that through, a metric we called lead time.
Let's talk about those mates. I mean, these are kind of a family of purpose-built agents that cover different stages of the product development lifecycle. So could you maybe kind of walk us through how something moves from maybe idea from one mate onto another through the process?
Sure. So where we focused was, we actually picked a particular area in the process, and we wanted to get it right. There were certain things that engineers within the organization didn't love to do, right? They didn't love to document. They didn't love to write unit test cases. They didn't like to write regression testing. And so what we did was, we actually brought this technology, Devin in this case, in, and we worked directly with our quality engineering teams to develop and understand, like, what are the skills that we would have to teach this agent to do in order for us to actually offload the work that they do today. And that started off a program we called our Quality Evolution, which later got termed Quality Mate. And if you think of a mate, where the name mate came from was, it was a teammate, right? We wanted people to think of these as like a teammate, like somebody I work with, right? Like, this is my quality teammate. Like, that agent is going to be part of my engineering responsibility, ultimately to be able to shift ownership of more of that software development lifecycle to the engineering managers, by giving them these mates to run, instead of having like individuals and these handoffs and everything else through that. And so we started with Quality Mate. And that's the particular area that we really focused on getting right, because there were a lot of lessons learned. And then, once we developed that, we rolled it out to further parts of the organization within the SDLC.
Were there, as you developed these mates, as you sort of automated the stages of the product lifecycle, were there some that were harder to do and some that were easier to do? I mean, were there any particular stages that proved particularly challenging to automate in this way?
Yeah, for sure. There were certain things that it did very well, right? Like, right out of the box, it wrote unit test cases very well. It documented code repositories very well. It developed code pretty well. One of the areas that we found it was difficult in was, like, remediating complex bugs, because of the number of source systems it had to touch. And what we learned with this was that you develop techniques, and as you work with these agents more, you develop certain techniques. So, for example, like in one particular product, it was barely resolving any bugs. It couldn't fix them, until someone on the engineering team that was working with them actually developed a way to ask it, hey, go do a root cause analysis on what this issue was, and then feed it back into the agent. And when he developed that technique, all of a sudden we went from it being able to resolve 0% of the bugs that we had out there to resolving 50% of the bugs out there, right? Just by changing the technique. So see that these are some of the techniques that we learned along the way, and then we expanded that out to the other groups that started building their own mates.
And as I understand it, this is now being used across the board. It has been used across the board at Litera, and in particular, for example, I guess in particular, if I understand, it was used in the development of Lito, Litera's AI application. Do I have that right? If so, I mean, could you kind of talk about how that was used to develop Lito?
Yeah, that's right. So when you look at Lido, Lido went from idea to our official launch, into preview within 6 months, which would have been nearly impossible previously, and that was with a team of 5 at the time. Right. And to be able to do that, the only way to do that was to be able to utilize these mates within the development of that, both in the development of the code, in refining the requirements and building test cases, and ultimately deploying it, into the environments. So that was really key to the ability for us to be able to take something from idea into a working product that quickly.
I think you, as I recall, you said earlier in the conversation that you kind of invited people to participate in this within your engineering staff. But as I understand it, you've since kind of made it mandatory for engineers to use this. Do I have that right?
Yeah, we did. I mean, we wanted to first really understand how far we could take this and the real quality of what it could produce and refine it. I would say pretty quickly we learned in the first 3 to 4 months that anybody not utilizing these tool sets was at a disadvantage. And we were seeing, junior and mid-level engineers produce more code in some cases than senior level engineers and be able to produce more output there. And so, what we did is, before we mandated it, we actually stood up a learning and development program. One of the things I didn't mention was part of the success of this was actually peeling away a number of engineering team members and hiring some to do nothing but the advancement of AI, both in our commercial products as well as internally in how we develop it. So, we have a team now of just over 30 now that are dedicated to that. And part of that group was an AI pod that we called Software Composers, where their whole goal was to advance the use of these coding tools and coding assistants within the organization. And that involved everything from weekly, what we call our fuel or learning sessions. That is 1 hour a week on showing how the tools can be used, what best practices are. We set up channels within teams and win rooms so that we could, people who had done something really cool could post it there. And so we taught them how to use it. We gave them opportunities and asking questions. We gave them, resources to be able to be successful. And then once we did that, in our mind, it was, if you still refuse to use them at this point, you probably didn't have the mindset we were looking for here at Litera. So we did make it mandatory that everybody in the organization utilize these tools. And we didn't specify a tool. We actually gave them options of tools. So if they want to use GitHub Copilot, they want to use Cursor, they want to use Claude Code, they want to use Devin, they have opportunities to use any of those. We just want them using something.
Are there parts of this process where humans still remain essential components?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's still human validation, there's safety and security. The other thing too was as we developed it to assist people in their specific jobs, ultimately with human verification. Now that we have multiple mates across the entire SDLC, which have been refined for those particular functions, there is a group working right now to stitch all those together so that, if something comes into the SDLC, doesn't pass a quality check with a quality agent, it gets sent back to the development agent to go and fix that issue and then bring it back again. So we now have almost agents talking to agents. But in that, there will always be human checkpoints. What we've defined as the new AI SDLC that we're weaving these agents together now, there's going to be at least 3 human checkpoints there. There will be a validation of the requirements to ensure the requirements are how we want them and that it has the expected outcome. There will be a check on the development and whether the code that has come out is acceptable and meets all of our architectural standards. And then there will be a final check prior to it getting pushed to production to validate it's ready for production. So those are the three human touch points we've defined in the new SDLC. The goal is to try to get it down to those three. There's still more in there just because as we refine it, we need to trust it. And then the other key piece of this was making sure that within our DevOps pipelines that we have specific gates to ensure that we don't put something out there that we shouldn't. So we have a quality gate where things get checked in quality. And then we also have a security gate to ensure that everything is secure and we're not putting anything out there that would put our customers' data at risk. And those are not AI agents. Those are specific rules-based engines that have been well-defined over some time.
Mm-hmm. In the article you published on our site, you talk about, and you've alluded to them in this interview, that you talk about the productivity gains from employing this system that go from, I think, roughly threefold to as much as eightfold in some areas. What metrics about this are important to you in terms of evidence that this is working the way you want it to be working?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it comes down to value and outcomes, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're not, there's been some discussion about like, just putting out more code doesn't make it more valuable, right? It's actually achieving the outcomes. The good news is we had such a backlog of work and we knew what those outcomes would be if we developed it and we put those particular features out in market that they would have an expected outcome. And so, by being able to deliver more of those features, by being able to deliver more frequently into our SDLC, there's inherent value that's been added to that. So, we use that number and, it's looked at in different ways. It looked at how many PRs per developer we're putting out, which, defines the frequency. And then we also look at like how many lines of code have changed or been added per developer. They're not the only metrics, just putting out more code does not make it better, but we look at a multiple of what we call our metrics that matter, and we assess it across all three of those ultimately to define value.
One of the interesting effects of all this is that you are starting to see bottlenecks somewhere that you probably didn't see them previously. Can you talk about where those bottlenecks are developing and how you're addressing that?
Yeah. No, it's very true, right? Like anytime you speed up one area, you typically just move the bottleneck to another area. So early on, as these tools became available, they were really focused around what I would say are like engineering velocity and improving quality. And so we were leveraging them for there. And so as we were rolling this out, we started to struggle with getting requirements written for engineers so that they could develop it. So that led to the development of one of our other mates, which is our PO mate, right? And the whole idea of that was to take an idea and develop a product requirements document out of it that was ready for an agent to ingest, right? So that was one that we had to solve for, and utilizing other tools like Replit for building prototypes, design was a concern. And then teams started using Claude Design in order to build designs faster. So that was an area. DevOps maturity. So we were producing features and we were getting them ready, but we couldn't get them into production fast enough, right? So we built our DevOps agent to assist with that and getting our DevOps maturity to where, we could do it. And now what's interesting is the conversation is around how much can a customer consume? So if you could put out 100 features a week, can a customer actually consume that much knowledge, especially when you might have to train 1,000 lawyers on a new feature, right? You can release so frequently. So that's the conversation now is how do we improve our go-to-market strategies, not just on the customer side, but even internal enablement, right? Like how do we enable our sales teams to understand how much we're putting out?
Yeah. So if I'm listening to this interview right now and I'm at a law firm and I'm not in the tech side of the law firm, I'm a practitioner perhaps or some other professional within the firm. Why does any of this matter to me? What's the advantage to the customer here, the law firm customer, in terms of what this has enabled you to do?
Yeah, well, it's improved it on a number of fronts. Frustrations, I think using any software are very, very similar in that, I have certain bugs I want remediated and, I want them fixed. I have certain features that I need in order to make me more productive in the firm. This has enabled us to do that, right? So if you look at the measures we look at, right, it's not just velocity about putting out more, but it's like how many features have we delivered that customers are wanting? How many bugs have we been able to burn down? In one of our products and instances, we had over 800 bugs in the product. And utilizing AI, we've now burned it down to, I think it's less than 20 is what we have in the backlog right now. So that's a significant improvement of being able to address a number of issues that were causing satisfaction issues with our customer. And so we see the benefits of that, and from a law firm perspective, we've gotten feedback like, finally, right? You've resolved these issues for me. You've made it better.
And switching from that law firm customer to maybe another CTO out there listening to this right now who's fascinated and wants to try and begin a similar journey. What's your advice? What's the best project? What's the best way to get started on this?
Yeah, I alluded to it earlier, but I think the number one thing is, don't do it as a side job, right? Like, actually get the dedication. Make sure that you have people dedicated to the success of this initiative, because I think when it becomes like a part-time initiative, you don't see the same success, right? So get that support from your leadership team, your C level, your board level, whatever it is, to make that investment up front. That's how you're going to see the most significant gains. In fact, like, even though we did that, I wish we would have gone bigger initially. I wish we would probably double the size of the team, because I think we'd be further along, than where we're at today. And then the other area is, you know, pilot it in a particular area. One of the things I love that we did was that example I gave you where, we didn't require people to use it. We actually wanted to see who would volunteer. And what came out of that were champions. We started to see champions of the technology. We started to see people who were pushing the envelope. They became mentors to other people in the team. And so you knew who to lean on when, a new model came out, or when a new technique came out, or things like that. So those are really valuable in the beginning, and get it right in one area, because you learn so much in getting it right in one area. Even though we didn't go for all, 8 of our mates, we got it right in the quality mate and the dev mate areas. And then that enabled us to build out the other mates pretty effectively, and learn from what we did already.
Well, Greg, this is really fascinating, and I'll include a link to this in the show, right up to the full article that you wrote, which goes into a whole lot more detail on all of this. But is there anything else that you wanted to point out about this that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
No, I mean, it's been incredible. It's empowering. I have several colleagues who are CTOs, across the industry. It's interesting to hear people's perspective. There are still some that are very hesitant and, concerned with it, both from, does it really work? What are the security risks in it? I think you need to overcome that pretty quickly, because more companies that are adopting it, they're moving faster than others out there. And, it's hard to say where it's all going to go. I know there's some fear around where it's going to go, but embracing it, because the folks that are embracing it are really becoming, what we term 10Xers here. They're doing 10X the amount of work, by utilizing the tools, and it is empowering.
It's fascinating. Greg, thanks so much for your time and for telling us all about this today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it.
That's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you get your podcast, or you can find us on YouTube at LawNextPR. Just search for that there. This is Bob Ambrogi. Thanks for listening.